Fez is a 2012 indie puzzle platform game developed by Polytron Corporation and published by Polytron, Trapdoor, and Microsoft Studios. The player character Gomez receives a fez that reveals his two-dimensional world to be one of four sides of a three-dimensional world. The player rotates between these four 2D views to realign platforms and solve the game's puzzles. The object of the game is to collect cubes and cube fragments to restore order to the universe. The game was called an underdog darling of the indie game scene during its high-profile and protracted 5-year development cycle. Fez designer and Polytron founder Phil Fish gained celebrity status for his outspoken public persona and his prominence in the 2012 documentary Indie Game, the movie, which detailed Fez's final stages of development and Polytron's related legal issues. Fez met critical acclaim upon its April 2012 release for Xbox Live Arcade. The game was ported to other platforms following the expiration of a year-long exclusivity agreement. Reviewers commended the game's emphasis on discovery and freedom, but criticized its technical issues, in-game navigation, and endgame backtracking. They likened the game's rotation mechanic to the 2D-3D shifts of Echochrome, Super Paper Mario, and Crush. Fez won awards including the Sia Mas McNally Grand Prize and Eurogamer's 2012 Game of the Year. It had sold 1 million copies by the end of 2013, and it influenced games such as Monument Valley, Crossy Road, and Secrets of Rare-80 A planned sequel was cancelled when Fish abruptly left the industry. Gameplay. Fez is a two-dimensional puzzle platform game set in a three-dimensional world. The player character Gomez lives peacefully on a 2D plane until he receives a red fez and witnesses the breakup of a giant golden hexahedron that tears the fabric of space-time and reveals a third dimension. After the game appears to glitch, reset, and reboot, the player can rotate between four 2D views of the 3D world, as four sides around a cube-like space. This rotation mechanic reveals new paths through the levels by connecting otherwise inaccessible platforms, and is the basis of Fez's puzzles. For example, floating platforms become a solid road, discontinuous ladders become whole, and platforms that move along a track stay on course. The object of the game is to collect cubes and cube fragments, which accrete to restore order to the universe. In search of these cubes, Gomez traverses the game environment by jumping between ledges. Other platforming elements change with the level themes, including crates that activate switches, bombs that reveal passages, and pistons that launch Gomez airborne. The basic idea for the 2D, 3D aesthetic really just started with the Trixel idea. I figured that if we built our entire game world from these little cubes, all perfectly aligned on a 3D grid, we'd get this 3D pixel look. Fez designer Phil Fish, 2007 Gamer Sutra interview. The exploratory parts of the game feature a series of arcane codes and glyphs, treasure maps and chests, and secret rooms. Players are left without guidance to determine whether game elements are decipherable sub-puzzles or simply false signals. These sorts of puzzles include hidden warp gates, enigmatic obelisks, invisible platforms, sequences of tetraminos, a ciphered alphabet, and QR codes. One of the game's recurring themes is an ancient civilization that attempted to make sense of their dimensionality, as told through artifacts. Fez has no enemies, bosses, or punishments for failure. The player character quickly respawns upon falling to his death. The game's designer described Fez as a stop-and-smell-the-flowers kind of game. It prioritizes puzzle solving and patience over the platforming genre's traditional interest in dexterity. Fez features a pixelated art style and a limited color palette reminiscent of the 8-bit era. Its homage includes Tetris tetraminos inscribed on the walls and in the sky, The Legend of Zelda treasure chest animations, Super Mario Bros. Mushroom levels, travel by pipe, and floating platforms. The game's settings include forests, factories, a coastal lighthouse, an urban city, and a library. Fez's New Game Plus mode adds a first-person perspective feature and lets the player revisit areas to collect anti-cubes from harder puzzles. This second half of the game is more challenging and focuses on code cracking. Development. Fez's 5-year development cycle is known for its protracted length and amount of public exposure. Nathan Grayson of EG247 likened its rocky history to an indie Duke Nukem Forever, and Polygon reviewer Arthur Gies noted its standing reputation as an underdog darling of the indie game scene. Its designer, Phil Fish, became renowned in a way unusual for game developers due to his prominence in the 2012 indie game, The Movie. Apart from Fez, which was released to wide acclaim, Fish himself became known for his outspoken and acerbic public persona. Fez began as a collaboration between Canadian indie developers Fish and Sean McGrath. They worked on McGrath's idea for a puzzle game in which a 3D space was viewed from 4 2D angles. Though their partnership broke down due to creative differences, the entirety of Fez's design, story, and art descends from this game mechanic. Fish continued to work on the project in his spare time and solicited for a programmer on DeviantArt, where he found Renaud Bedard. Fez was first announced in July 2007 on the independent gaming source. It was nominated for 2 awards at the 2008 Game Developers Conference Independent Games Festival. When Fish's employer did not permit him time off to attend the awards, he quit. He later recalled this moment as when he became indie. The game won excellence in visual art, and its presence created a surge of public interest in Fez that rode a concurrent swell of interest in indie game development as a whole. Fish received a Canadian government loan to open Polytron Corporation as a startup company and began full-time work on Fez. In July 2009, Polytron announced that Fez would launch in early 2010 as an Xbox Live Arcade exclusive. Development continued with an experimental spirit until the company ran out of money. Fish borrowed from friends and family to keep the company open and considered cancelling the project before the nearby COI's developer-publisher, Trapdoor, offered to help. Fish felt that the Trapdoor partnership rescued the game. At times it seemed as though the noise surrounding Fez might drown out the game's own voice. There were the controversial outbursts from creator Phil Fish in the press, the rumors of vicious infighting during development, the endless delays, and, of course, the big shot movie documenting the struggling creator's days as his life fell apart around the game in painful slow motion. Fish is shown preparing for Fez's booth at PAX East 2011, an earlier show, in the 2012 documentary film Indie Game, The Movie. The film chronicles the game development stories of several indie developers. As a subplot, the film presents Fish amidst a legal dispute with a former business partner that jeopardizes Fez's future. Game Informer called Fish the film's most memorable developer, and Rock, Paper, Shotgun wrote that Fish is portrayed as theatrical in a way that exacerbates his already outspoken reputation. Eurogamer said that the part when Fish resolves to kill himself if he does not release his game is the film's most startling moment. Near the end of Fez's development, Fish told a Gamer Sutra reporter that he had received positive feedback from IGF chairman Brandon Boyer and Braid designer Jonathan Blow, but that he felt burnt out. The final game included almost none of the original work from the first 2 years of development. After several delays, Fez was submitted for certification in February 2012. Fez was released on April 13, 2012, and it sold 200,000 copies during its year-long exclusivity to the Xbox Live Arcade platform. Fish rebuked Polytron's co-publisher, Microsoft Studios, for botching the game's release by way of lackluster publicity. Several months later, Polytron entered a high-profile dispute with Microsoft over the cost of patching Fez. Nearly a year after Fez's launch, Fish announced a Windows PC port for release on May 1, 2013. OS X and Linux ports debuted on September 11, 2013, and PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, and PlayStation Vita ports by Blitworks debuted on March 25, 2014. Ouya and iOS ports were also announced. Bedard stayed to port the Windows release before joining Toronto's Capybara Games. He credited Polytron's long development cycle to his own inexperience in game development, the game's scope, and Fish's perfectionism. Fish had hoped that players would discuss Fez's nuances online after its release. Players collaborated online for a week to solve the final monolith puzzle by using a cryptanalytic attack known as brute force. Ars Technica described the apparent end to Fez's harder puzzles as anticlimactic, but Fish told Eurogamer in March 2013 that hidden in-game secrets remain to be found. More than 3 years after its digital launch, Fez received a physical release designed by Fish and limited to a signed edition of 500 in December 2015. The deluxe package included the soundtrack and a stylized red notebook with gold foil inlay. Design Bedard wrote Fez in Microsoft Visual C# Express and XNA Game Studio Express. He coded the level editor and the game engine, Trixel, which converts 2D tiles into four-sided 3D voxels. Fish made 2D pixel art in Photoshop for each side of the Trixel, which Bedard's custom software compiled into 3D game assets. Fish would then design levels in the level editor by extruding surfaces, a process he found overwhelming, but akin to playing with Lego blocks. In their workflow, Fish first proposed ideas that Bedard would implement. The two would then discuss and fine-tune the addition. They worked well together. The game came to adopt Metroidvania mechanics, with secret passages, warp gates, and cheat codes. Fish cited Myst as an inspiration and compared its open-world, non-linear narrative, and obtuse meta-puzzles to Fez's own alphabet numeric system, and an, almost unfairly hard-to-get, second set of collectibles. He was also inspired by the Nintendo Entertainment System games of his youth, Hayao Miyazaki's signature, open blue sky, feel-good, atmosphere, and Fumito Ueda's ICO. Fish sought to emulate ICO's feeling of nostalgic and isolated loneliness, and a Ueda's development philosophy wherein all non-essential game elements are removed. Fish made a personal challenge of designing a game without relying on established mechanics. As such, Fez was always a peaceful game that never contained an antagonist. Music. Rich Vreeland, also known as Disaster Piece, composed the game's chiptune-esque electronic soundtrack. Despite his background in chiptune, Vreeland limited his use of that genre's mannerisms in the score. He worked with soft synth pads and reverb to push the score closer to an 80s synthesizer sound. He also reduced reliance on percussion and incorporated distortion techniques like bit crushing and wow. Vreeland opted for slower passages with varying tempos that could ebb, flow, and breathe with the player. He left some portions of Fez without music. Vreeland worked on its soundtrack at night for about 14 months while scoring Shoot Many Robots, and Brandon McCartan of Aquaria contributed the game's sound effects. Vreeland's first composition for the game became the soundtrack's first track. Vreeland wanted to use tape recorders for their distinctive sound, but potential audio syncing issues with this method led him to employ digital recording. Portions of the soundtrack dynamically change between several dozen constituent elements and react to the game environment. For example, the puzzle track's elements change musical key based on the in-game time of day. Certain tracks were intended to imitate real-world sounds, such as those of bats, thunderstorms, taiko, and water falling from stalactites. Other tracks expanded from improvisations. Vreeland was also inspired by the Lord of the Rings Shire theme, 1980s horror media, the soundtrack of Damascene game Jasper's Journeys, The Legend of Zelda dungeon music, the Mass Effect soundtrack Tangerine Dream, and Steve Reich. Continuum is a synthesized rendition of Frédéric Chopin's Prelude, Op. 28. No. 4. Instruments used in recording include the sonic charge synth plant, Minimoog, synthetic flute, and boomwhacker. The soundtrack was released in a digital format on April 20, 2012. Pre-orders for the soundtrack topped the Bandcamp charts. Kirk Hamilton of Kotaku wrote that Fez's sound effects evoked Jim Guthrie's Super Brothers Sword and Sorcery EP audio. Joshua Kopstein of The Verge called the work fantastic, and described it as a cross between a 1980s Vangular synth odyssey and a submerged vinyl record from an arcade game. And former Matt Miller wrote that the soundtrack contributed to Fez's 80s nostalgia vibe. Eurogamer described the music as lush, spooky, and electrifying, and Edge compared it to holes put through a Mega Drive. Ollie Welsh of Eurogamer wrote that the music matched the game's themes of hidden depth. Welsh heard influences of 60s English psychedelia, 70s krautrock, 80s synth, and Eric Satie. He added that the soundtrack's contribution to Fez was incalculable. Damien Caspar of Game Developer used Vreeland's soundtrack to show that a retro gaming aesthetic in sound and visuals could be both futuristic and nostalgic, and provide the right voice to support the game's design intentions. Game Developer listed Vreeland in their 2012 Power 50 for his work on the soundtrack, which they described as atmospheric, pensive, and maybe even a little bit melancholy. In keeping with Fez's theme of secrets, images visible only through spectrogram were embedded into the soundtrack audio. Vreeland released a remix album, FZ Side F, a year later on April 20, 2013. It features tracks from other artists, including Jim Guthrie. Vreeland later released another remix album, FZ Side Z, and all three albums were included in the August 2013 Game Music Bundle 5.